Good morning, colleagues. The 9,790th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2024/835, the text of a draft resolution submitted by Algeria, Ecuador, Guyana, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia and Switzerland. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it, and I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President, for so swiftly facilitating the request to convene this meeting. I have the honour to introduce this draft resolution on behalf of the 10 elected member states of the Security Council, namely Algeria, Ecuador, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, Switzerland, and my own country, Guyana. The resolution before the Council is the product of several weeks of consultations among all Council members. It was prompted by the Council's deep concern over the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, including what was unfolding in North Gaza, and the need for an urgent response to that situation. I take this opportunity to thank all delegations for their very constructive stance throughout the negotiations. Your flexibility has allowed us to develop a text which we feel responds to many critical elements of the conflict. Madam President, the text before us recalls the Security Council's primary responsibility to uphold international peace and security, and demands an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire to be respected by all parties, and reiterates the Council's demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. This is one of the most important provisions of the text, since it addresses some of the most fundamental concerns regarding the ongoing hostilities. The text also demands that the parties comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Emphasis is also placed on the last 4 resolutions adopted by the Council in relation to this conflict, reaffirming the provisions of those resolutions and demanding in particular the full and unconditional implementation of Resolution 2735 adopted in June. Critically, the draft also demands immediate access by the civilian population in the Gaza Strip to basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable to its survival, while rejecting any effort to starve Palestinians. It also demands the facilitation of full, rapid, safe, and unhindered entry of humanitarian assistance at scale to and throughout the Gaza Strip, and the delivery of that assistance to all Palestinian civilians who need it, including to civilians in besieged North Gaza. The draft resolution acknowledges UNRWA as the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza and calls on all parties to enable the agency to carry out its mandate in all areas of operation. Madam President, the text represents a broad consensus achieved on the basis of careful, inclusive, and transparent negotiations. While several divergent positions have found a balance in the text, the dominant concern has been to provide a legally binding obligation to end the hostilities in Gaza. The E10 sincerely hopes that all delegations will support the text, since it aligns with our Charter responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. I thank you.
The representative of Guyana for their statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favour of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024-835 please raise their hand? Those against? The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favour, 1 vote against, 0 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, the United States deeply regrets this Council finds itself here again. The United States worked for weeks in good faith to avoid this outcome. We made clear throughout negotiations we could not support an unconditional ceasefire that failed to release the hostages. Because, as this Council has previously called for, a durable end to the war must come with the release of the hostages. These two urgent goals are inextricably linked. This resolution abandoned that necessity, and for that reason, the United States could not support it. Simply put, this resolution would have sent a dangerous message to Hamas. There's no need to come back to the negotiating table. Hamas would have seen it as a vindication of its cynical strategy to hope and pray the international community forgets about the fate of more than 100 hostages for more than 20 member states who have been held for 410 days. We must not let that happen, ever. Let me say this clearly. There are still 7 American citizens in the hands of Hamas. We will not forget them. For our part, we will continue to pursue a diplomatic solution that brings peace, security, and freedom to Palestinians in Gaza. The United States, along with partners in the region, has worked tirelessly to achieve such a deal. But we are not there yet. Why? Because Hamas has rejected deal after deal after deal. And yet, some members of this Council, in their public statements, ignore the callous intransigence of Hamas and indeed refuse to condemn Hamas, which I'll note this resolution failed to do, again. Some members of this Council don't seem to want to confront the reality that today, it is not Israel standing in the way of a ceasefire and hostage deal. It is Hamas. Israel has said it is prepared to have a temporary ceasefire in exchange for the release of a few hostages, and then build on that to bring each and every hostage home. Colleagues, the messages we send to the world through these resolutions, they matter. And this resolution had several other problems. Among the most glaring, I've already mentioned the failure to condemn Hamas for its October 7 terrorist attack. It's inexplicable that more than 13 months since that day, some members of this Council are missing the plot, that they refuse to acknowledge it is Hamas that instigated this conflict. It is Hamas that has put millions of Palestinian civilians in harm's way and has brought the region to the precipice of a broader war. Colleagues, we've been clear that it is time for this war to end, for the hostages to be released, and for Palestinian civilians to begin rebuilding their lives. More immediately, the United States has been explicitly clear to Israel that it has a responsibility to facilitate humanitarian access and the delivery of aid at scale. We believe the process of laying out the terms of what we expect from Israel in a very detailed way has generated a change in Israel's approach. American diplomacy will continue to press for more aid in and throughout Gaza, which requires a sustained, expanded implementation of urgent steps to improve conditions on the ground. We regret that the Council could have incorporated compromise language the UK put forward to bridge the existing gaps and support these humanitarian steps. With that language, this resolution should have been adopted, and the Council would have reinforced ongoing diplomatic efforts on the ground. Indeed, we also put forward many formulations over the past few weeks that could have bridged the gaps and seen this Council speak with one voice. Despite these proposals from the United States throughout this process, many on this Council did not engage seriously on their merits and rather continued to seek a path of discord. In fact, we heard that some desired a U.S. veto rather than of a consensus product. That is cynical and unfortunate. Colleagues, this is not how this process should work. Despite the failure of the Council to reach consensus, and again, I think there was a path available to do so, the United States will keep working to improve the humanitarian situation on the ground, which, as we've said before, requires unhindered access and sustained humanitarian aid flowing into Gaza and reaching all those in need. Colleagues, in closing, let me just note that the United States has taken a very clear position since this war began, which is that Israel had a right to defend itself after the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. The United States also, over the course of the past year, has done more than any other country to take tangible steps to improve the humanitarian conditions in Gaza, even as the situation remains dire. We have also done more than anyone to work with the government of Israel in an effort to minimize civilian harm over the course of the conflict, and we continue to emphasize to Israel that more must be done to save lives. The United States also continued to work with regional partners to support a revitalized Palestinian Authority that can assume responsibility for governing Gaza and the West Bank. We've encouraged regional integration efforts that would strengthen regional stability and marginalize sources of instability. And we've never wavered in our support for a two-state solution. It's vital that we end this war in a way that charts a path forward in the post-conflict period that provides governance, security, and reconstruction in Gaza and restores dignity for civilians caught in the middle of a war they did not want. We must work toward a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side within two democratic states and enjoy equal measures of security, dignity, and freedom, where Israel is secure within its own borders. Colleagues, an unconditional ceasefire with Hamas means this Council accepts Hamas retaining power in Gaza. The United States will never accept this. Rather than adopting a resolution that emboldens Hamas, let's instead demand Hamas implement Resolution 2735 without further condition or delay. Let's continue to ensure Israel facilitates additional humanitarian aid into Gaza. And let's work to bring a durable end to the suffering and misery of Hamas's many victims since October 7. This resolution sent the wrong message to the parties, but our actions and diplomacy on the ground will continue to push them in a more positive direction. We invite others on this Council to join us. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. The draft text we had in front of us today is the result of a common conviction by the 10 elected members, the E10, that this Council can no longer stand idle in the face of such uncontrolled violence, disregard for international law, including IHL, and a man-made humanitarian catastrophe. We sincerely thank Guyana for diligently coordinating the initiative. Let us be clear. The text we had in front of us today was by no means a maximalist one. It represented the bare minimum of what is needed to begin to address the desperate situation on the ground. It was a genuine effort to bring the Council to speak with one voice on a conflict that risks dragging the entire region over the precipice. It is deeply regretted that, due to the use of the veto, this Council has once again failed to uphold its responsibility to maintain international peace and security. President, as the region continues to descend into further violence, civilians across all sides continue to endure unimaginable suffering. In North Gaza, hungry Palestinian mothers trudge through a destroyed landscape, seeking food and medicine for their malnourished children, while airstrikes and hostilities continue to decimate their land and people. Innocent civilians have been held hostage in squalor by Hamas and other armed groups for over a year. Lebanese and Israeli families along both sides of the Blue Line and beyond have been forcibly displaced and their homes and communities from their homes and communities in an effort to seek safety. These are the consequences of the ongoing failure to secure a peaceful solution to this conflict. The draft resolution would have finally made a clear demand for an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. It would have demanded that the humanitarian needs of Palestinians in Gaza are urgently met, including for civilians in besieged North Gaza. It would have demanded the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. It would also have sought to call on all parties to enable UNRWA to carry out its mandate as adopted by the General Assembly in the face of grave threats emanating from the recently adopted legislation in Israel. Faced with this Council's failure to adopt a resolution which clearly speaks to these demands, Malta stresses that the parties to the conflict are fully obligated to comply and immediately and effectively implement the relevant existing Council resolutions and the orders of the ICJ. We unequivocally stress that international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, must be respected by all parties. Despite our disappointment due to the result of today's vote, we must not give up. On the contrary, we must redouble our efforts to keep pushing for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. The time has come to bring an end to this extraordinary suffering, to restore hope, to give peace a chance. A peace based on a two-state solution in accordance with Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, at the outset, I extend my gratitude to those who voted in favor of the draft resolution presented by the 10 elected members who are the representative of the collective will of the international community. It is a sad day for the Security Council, for the United Nations, and for the international community as a whole. The draft resolution this Council failed to adopt today suit only to break its deafening silence 5 months after the adoption of the Resolution 2735. 5 months during which the Security Council remained idle, remained hand-tied. This text was far from ideal, but it represented the bare minimum that should have united us. Algeria, my country, has consistently called for enforcing Security Council decisions and imposing sanctions on those who defy the collective will of the international community. For this reason, our position was to adopt a resolution under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. There were significant concessions during negotiations. Yet, one member chose to block any action from this Council. Today's message is clear. To the Israeli occupying power first. You may continue your genocide. You may continue your collective punishment of the Palestinian people with complete impunity. In this chamber, you enjoy immunity. To the Palestinian people, another clear message. While the overwhelming majority of the world stands in solidarity with your plight, tragically, others remain indifferent to your suffering. Madam President, we must ask ourselves today, as human beings, is it not enough that 44,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, 70% of whom are women and children? How many more must perish before this Council imposes a ceasefire? Is it not enough that the number of orphans in Gaza now range between 17,000 and 18,000, many of whom have no surviving family members to care for them? Gaza, once known as a city of children, has tragically become a city of orphans. How many more children must be orphaned before this Council takes actions? Is it not enough that over 170 journalists have been killed in Gaza? And how many more journalists must die before this Council acts? Colleagues, Israel, the occupying power, has killed more journalists in 1 year than those lost in World War II and the Vietnam War combined. Where are those? Where are those who proclaim to be defenders of human rights and freedom of expression? Why are they silent in the face of such atrocities? Is it not enough that at least 326 aid workers have been killed? The highest number ever recorded in history. How many more must sacrifice their lives before this Council decides sanctions? Is it not enough that over 1,000 health workers have been killed? How many more must fall before this Council takes decisive action? Is it not enough that almost the entire population of Gaza has been forcibly displaced and face famine now, with some already succumbing to hunger? How many more must starve to death before this Council responds? Madam President, in the past year, the Council adopted 4 resolutions. Negotiations were conducted. Calls from every corner of the globe were made. Yet, nothing has stopped the Israeli killing machine in Gaza. And the reason is painfully clear. Israeli leaders operate with the full knowledge that they enjoy impunity. They enjoy immunity. They are certain that this body, the Security Council, tasked with maintaining international peace and security by the UN Charter, will be prevented on acting to halt the genocide. Today, we have missed an opportunity. This failure that will have devastating consequences for the international order. But rest assured, this will not be the last time the Security Council will be forced to address a resolution on Palestine. As we have said before, and as we have delivered, we will soon return to the Security Council to demand an immediate and unconditional and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And this time, with even a firmer language under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And our efforts will not cease until the Council make a decisive action. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, China is very disappointed with the result of today's vote. Guyana, Algeria, and other E10 members of the Council demonstrated maximum amount of sincerity and constructiveness during the consultation of the draft resolution. The U.S. long use of the veto has dashed the hope of the people of Gaza for survival, pushing them further into darkness and desperation. I said during the Council's debate on Monday that every moment will be recorded in history and will be judged by history. We cannot imagine how the vote today, as well as the Security Council's failure to respond to the Gaza's conflict over the past 13 months, can escape the harsh judgment of history. In the future, when looking back, people will find it hard to believe what happened. When the U.S. cast its first veto on 18 October last year, nearly 3,000 civilians had been killed in Gaza. By the time the U.S. cast its second veto, 17,000 people had been killed as a result of Israeli bombardment. With each veto, the death toll in Gaza continued to rise. With the U.S. exercised its veto for the fifth time on April 18th this year, the death toll in Gaza stood at some 34,000. Now that nearly 44,000 people has been killed in Gaza, yet the United States still did not hesitate to use its veto. 44,000. It is not some cold statistics. It could be a minor, a nursing mother, or the breadwinner of a family. The loss of each and every one of them means internal pain for the surviving relatives. People cannot help but to ask, do Palestinian lives mean nothing? Can't the deaths of 44,000 people win even a little bit of sympathy from the United States? How many more people have to die before they wake up from their pretend slumber? In the future, when looking back, people will find it hard to understand what happened. The Security Council is mandated under the UN Charter to shoulder the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. It is incomprehensible why, for the past years or so, the United States has been so insistent in rendering the Council incapable of playing its role, leading to its paralysis. The U.S. claimed to be conducting parallel diplomatic efforts and has repeatedly promised that progress would be made soon in the negotiations. It is incomprehensible then why, to date, the so-called diplomatic negotiations has seen no progress. Why is Israel allowed to continue its military operations while consistently putting forth new conditions for negotiations? In the future, when looking back, people will find it inevitable to feel indignant. Israel has flagrantly breached every red line of international humanitarian law, with its actions causing an unprecedented humanitarian disaster. But even as famine is imminent in Gaza, the United States always seems to be able to find a justification to defend Israel. This represents a distortion and selective disregard of the applicable IHL. People keep learning something new they never knew before was possible, and how low one can stoop. No wonder people feel angry. People's indignation also stems from the fact that the continued supply of weapons from the U.S. has become a decisive factor in the war lasting so long, causing so many casualties and so much destruction. President, The U.S. representative earlier called for the release of hostages in the statement. Our position has been very clear from the beginning. All hostages must be released. An immediate and unconditional ceasefire must be established. Both are important factors. There should be no any conditionality. They cannot be linked to each other. Because facts have shown that Israel's military operations in Gaza have long exceeded the scope of rescuing hostages. Insistence on setting a precondition for ceasefire is tantamount to giving the green light to continuing the war and condoning the continued killing. The repeated use of veto by the United States has reduced the authority of the Security Council and international law to an all-time low, but it is never too late to recognize mistakes made and take corrective actions. We call on the U.S. to take its responsibilities as a permanent member of the Council seriously. The U.S. should stop being passive and evasive, stop dragging its feet deliberately. The U.S. should adopt an attitude accountable to history and support the Council in taking all necessary actions to achieve a ceasefire, save lives, and restore peace. And I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Slovenia voted in favour of the draft resolution, focusing on the demand for an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire. We thank Guyana for the able steering of E10 efforts as the coordinator and the other E10 members for the excellent cooperation in presenting this resolution. Since the start of the war in Gaza more than a year ago, Slovenia has been continuously calling for a strong, united voice from the Council on this issue. We have been supportive of every effort to find that unified response. It is undisputable that this Council is a primary body entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. It is the responsibility of every member state to contribute. As an elected member, our sense of responsibility has been growing. The war has brought pain and destruction, confrontations and shockwaves, limitation and attacks on the UN, and violations of international law. From the terrorist attack of Hamas on October 7th, the relentless attacks on civilians and limitation of humanitarian assistance in Gaza, including the siege of northern Gaza and unprecedented obstructions of UNRWA operations, this war represents everything the UN Charter stands against. We regret the veto has been cast. Even more, since this war, was its humanitarian impact and spillover effect, amounts to a serious threat to international peace and security. We deeply appreciate the work done by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States aimed at reaching a ceasefire deal on the ground. As we clearly stated during the adoption of the Resolution 2735, we believe that calls by the international community, efforts by mediators, and those of a bilateral nature are intertwined and should be mutually reinforcing. Madam President, the suffering in Gaza must end. The suffering of people in Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and in wider region must end. There must be an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. Hostages must be released. Humanitarian aid must be scaled up. We have heard countless briefings making it crystal clear. We must act now. It is this Council's responsibility to react to threats to international peace and security. There is an entire generation of children in Gaza that we are failing. They lost their families, their communities, schools, friends, their childhood. This is a war that the Council can and must stop with a united and unequivocal demand for a ceasefire. This is the first step towards achieving a comprehensive solution to the conflict, a first step to give those children a future. Slovenia will support further steps to peace, including an international peace conference and a commitment to global alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution, so that the future generations in Israel and Palestine can live side by side in peace, security, and prosperity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President,
la France
France
remercie
would like to
les membres
thank
élus du
the
Conseil de
elected
sécurité
members of
d'avoir
the Security
préparé
Council
ce
for
projet de
having prepared
résolution.
this draft
Elle regrette
resolution,
profondément
and we deeply
qu'il n'ait pas
regret
pu être adopté
that
ce
it
jour.
wasn't able to be adopted
La situation
today.
humanitaire dans
The
la bande de
humanitarian
Gaza
situation
est
in the Gaza
catastrophique
Strip is
et elle continue de se
disastrous,
détériorer.
and it continues to
Le
worsen
droit
day by day.
international humanitaire
International
est piétiné.
humanitarian law is being
Dans ces
trampled
conditions,
underfoot.
la seule
Under these
réponse
conditions,
aurait
the only
été
response
et demeure
would have been
un
and
cessez-le-feu
remains
immédiat
an
et
immediate
permanent.
and permanent
L'acheminement
ceasefire.
de l'aide doit
The
être à la
delivery
hauteur
of aid,
des besoins, en
must
particulier
meet
dans
the
le nord de
needs,
l'enclave,
particularly in the north
qui est
of the
menacé
enclave,
de famine.
which is threatened by famine.
Tous les otages doivent être
All of the
libérés sans délai
hostages must be
et sans
released without
condition.
delay and unconditionally.
Cette résolution
This resolution
exigeait précisément cela. De
specifically
façon très ferme.
required this very
La France,
firmly.
qui compte encore
France
2 otages
still
à Gaza,
has 2 hostages
déplore
in
que le
Gaza,
Conseil de
and we deeply
sécurité
regret
n'ait
that
pu
the
être
Security
en mesure de
Council
formuler
was
cette
not
exigence.
able to
Elle n'a
formulate
cessé
this demand.
et ne cessera de condamner les
We
attaques
will
terroristes
continue
du 7
to
octobre 2023. Le
condemn
Conseil de
the
sécurité doit
terrorist
faire de même
attacks of
sans
the 7th of
ambiguïté.
October
Il
2023. The
devra
Council
aussi,
must do likewise.
sur la base des paramètres agréés,
And on the basis of
œuvrer
agreed
à la
parameters,
mise en œuvre
we
concrète de
must
la
work
solution
to the
des 2 États.
implementation
Il
of a
faut des garanties
two-state
de
solution.
sécurité pour les
There must
Israéliens.
be
Il faut
security
aussi
guarantees for the
œuvrer
Israelis,
à la
and we
création
must
d'un
work
État
towards
indépendant,
the
viable et
creation of
contigu
an
pour les
independent,
Palestiniens.
viable and
La
contiguous
France continuera
Palestinian
d'œuvrer en
state.
faveur de ces
France will
objectifs.
continue to work towards
Je vous
these
remercie.
ends. Thank you very much.
The representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President.
Me disculpo, señora Presidenta.
Do forgive me,
Y
Madam President.
quiero explicar que el
I would
Ecuador
like to
ha
explain
votado
that
al favor del
Ecuador
proyecto de
voted in favor
resolución
of the
que
draft
acabamos de
resolution
considerar,
that we have
del
just
cual
considered,
Ecuador es corredactor,
and we are
junto con los demás miembros
co-drafter of this
elegidos,
together with the other
pues
elected
comparte
members,
el
because
sentido de
we
urgencia
share the feeling
para que el
of
Consejo
urgency
actúe
for
nuevamente
the
en
Council
pos
to act
de detener
once
la guerra,
again to put an
liberar a
end
los
to
rehenes que
war,
siguen en
to
poder de
ensure the
Hamas
release of the
y
hostages
atender la
held by Hamas,
catastrófica
and to
situación
attend to the
humanitaria
disastrous
de la
humanitarian
población civil en
situation
Gaza
facing the
al borde
civilian
de la hambruna.
population, in Gaza,
Por segunda vez en
approaching
este año,
famine. For the
los
second time
E10
this year,
aceptaron
the
el reto
E10
de
accepted
redactar
the
un
challenge
texto
of
que sea
drafting
aceptable
a text that would
para
be
todos los
acceptable
miembros del
to all
Consejo
members of the
y permita a
Council,
este
and that
cumplir
would
con su
allow it
responsabilidad
to fulfill
frente a una
its
situación
responsibility in
apremiante.
the face of a
El
pressing
proyecto de
situation.
resolución
The draft
es el
resolution
fruto de un
is
largo
the
proceso de
outcome of a long
negociación
process of
en el que han
negotiations
participado todos los
in which we
miembros del
saw the
Consejo
participation of
y
all
que ha sido
members of the
coordinado de
Council,
forma
and that was
hábil y
coordinated
delicada
in a very
por
swift
Guyana,
and
a cuya delegación
delicate
agradezco.
manner by the delegation of
El texto
Guyana,
que
and
hemos
we thank you for
considerado,
that.
el
The
Consejo
text that we
demanda
considered,
un cese
was
al fuego
asking the
inmediato,
Council to
la
require an
liberación de los
immediate
rehenes
ceasefire,
y el
the
acceso
release of
urgente de
hostages,
ayuda
and the
humanitaria
urgent
para la
delivery of
población
humanitarian
civil.
assistance for the civilian
Estas
population.
demandas son
These
compartidas
demands are
por una
shared
abrumadora
by
mayoría
an
de los
overwhelming
miembros de
majority
esta
of the
organización.
members of this organization.
Otros elementos
Other
de gran
elements
urgencia e
of
importancia
great urgency
también
and
se han
importance
incluido en
were
el
also
proyecto,
included in the
como la
draft
necesidad
resolution, such as the
de implementar
need
las
to
vigentes
implement
resoluciones adoptadas en meses
current
pasados y de
resolutions that
cumplir
were
las
adopted in
normas
previous
del
months
derecho
and to
internacional
meet the
humanitario.
standards of international
El texto
humanitarian law.
contiene,
The text
además,
also
una condena a
contains
todos los
a
actos terroristas,
condemnation of
lo que
all
incluye de
terrorist
forma
acts, which
implícita los
implicitly
cometidos por
includes
Hamas
those that
el
have
7 de
been committed
octubre
by
de
Hamas on the 7th of
2023
October
y a la toma de
2023
rehenes.
and the
Mi
taking
país
of
deplora
hostages.
una
My
vez más
delegation once
estos
again
execrables
deplores
actos,
these
causa
barbaric
inmediata
acts,
de la guerra que
the
asola
immediate cause
Gaza
of
desde
the
entonces.
war
En una
that has now
situación
laid
tan
waste to
compleja,
Gaza. In
un
such a
texto
complex
perfecto
situation,
a ojos de
a
todos
perfect
es
situation in
imposible.
everyone's eyes is impossible
Ecuador,
to attain.
por ejemplo,
Ecuador, for example,
preferiría adoptar una
would have
resolución
preferred to adopt
que contenga
a resolution
también
that would
una
also
explícita
contain an
condena
explicit
a los ataques
condemnation of
terroristas
the
del
terrorist
7 de
attacks of
octubre.
the 7th of October.
Sin embargo,
However,
los 14 votos
the
a favor
14 votes
son
in
una clara
favor
señal
are a
de que
clear
el proyecto
indication that
que el
the
E10 puso a
draft
consideración del
resolution
Consejo
that was
es
put
equilibrado
for
y
consideration
oportuno.
of the Council
Es
is timely
lamentable
and
que
appropriate,
no haya sido
and it's
adoptado
regrettable that it
debido al
has
voto
not been
negativo de un miembro
adopted
permanente.
due to the
Muchas
negative
gracias.
vote of a permanent member of the Council. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank Guyana, the coordinator of the E10 on the resolution on the situation in Gaza, for their commendable and tireless efforts in facilitating the negotiations. We thank all Council members for their engagement and flexibility in the negotiations. Sierra Leone voted in favor of the E10 resolution on the situation in Gaza in order to have a ceasefire and, more importantly, to save lives. We therefore deeply regret that the resolution was not adopted, even though 40 members of the Council, an overwhelming majority, voted for its adoption. 13 months into the conflict in the Gaza Strip, with over 43,500 deaths, hundreds of thousands injured, and about 1.7 million internally displaced persons, with women, children, and young people bearing the brunt of the conflict, it is long overdue for the Security Council, as guided by the Charter of the United Nations, to take an appropriate step to end the carnage in the Gaza Strip. While we recognize the tireless efforts displayed by this Council in adopting 4 resolutions so far, namely 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735, it is regrettable that the parties to the conflict have failed to fully comply with their respective provisions. The adoption of Resolution 2735 on 10th June 2024 had ushered in renewed optimism that through diplomatic efforts, a deal could be agreed upon that will achieve a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, ensure the release of hostages, guarantee the effective distribution of humanitarian assistance at scale throughout the Gaza Strip, and establish the framework for the reconstruction of Gaza and commence the process for the actualization of the two-state solution. Unfortunately, this process has been slow without any tangible progress, and every day that elapses, we witness more deaths and suffering. For this reason, and the many horrific humanitarian and security reports and briefings on the situation in the Gaza Strip, Sierra Leone joined the E10 initiative to have a text that clearly demands for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. The text further called for compliance with obligations under international law, access by the civilian population in the Gaza Strip to basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable for their survival, while acknowledging UNRWA's role in facilitating and distributing aid to civilians. An adoption of this text could have compelled the parties to the conflict to fulfill their legal, political, moral, and humanitarian obligations to the civilians in the Gaza Strip and the hostages held by Hamas since the 7th October 2023. It could have been a path to justice and an enforcement of accountability. It would have allowed this Council the opportunity to affirm its role and unite its strength to save humanity from destruction. Nevertheless, we will not despair, and so Sierra Leone remains committed to supporting any credible and serious political and diplomatic efforts that will finally address this protracted conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President,
признательны Гаяне и другим
Guyana
непостоянным
and the
членам
elected
Совета
members
за
of the
проявленную
Council for the
смелость
courage they've
и
shown
усилия по
and for the
продвижению проекта
efforts
резолюции,
to move
по которому
today's
сегодня
draft
состоялось голосование.
resolution forward. We supported the document, and we pay tribute to those responsible members of the Council who, just like us, understand that there's a need to have the speediest and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza as a gauge for general stabilization in the region. And now, I would like my colleagues to listen very carefully to the following part of my statement, and once I finish, I'll explain why. It is shocking that the U.S. has vetoed an effort to save the lives of Palestinians and Israelis. Well, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised about it. For months, the United States has obstructed and obfuscated, standing in the way of the Council action to address the catastrophic situation in Gaza and playing on one side of the conflict to advance its own political objectives at the expense of Palestinian lives. Today, the Council would have come together to call for a comprehensive ceasefire, protection of civilians, and solution to the whole complex of humanitarian problems faced by the Palestinians. The U.S. claims
что это в интересах региона,
it is
но голосует против резолюции, которую поддерживает подавляющее
in the interest of
большинство
the
стран
regions, but votes
региона,
against the
которые
resolution
принимаются ради
supported
его
by the
блага.
majority of regional countries,
Мы могли сегодня
which would have
потребовать,
passed for
чтобы
the
в
benefit
Газе
of the region. We could have
установилось
demanded today
немедленное,
an
безусловное,
immediate,
постоянное
unconditional, and
прекращение
sustainable
огня,
ceasefire in
а также
Gaza,
чтобы
as
немедленно и
well
без предусловий
as an
были
immediate and
освобождены все
unconditional
заложники.
release of all hostages.
Выше понимания
It is
нормального человека тот
unconscionable
факт, что Соединенные
that the
Штаты
U.S.
цинично
would
стоят на
cynically
пути
stand
принятия
in
таких
the way of demanding such
мер,
actions,
которые могли бы
actions
спасти жизни
to
в
save
худшем
lives
гуманитарном
in the
кризисе в
world's
мире.
worst humanitarian crisis.
Нам не нужны
We do
лекции от
not
Соединенных
need to be
Штатов по
lectured
лицемерию.
by the United States on
Лицемерие – это то, что
hypocrisy.
они демонстрируют на
Hypocrisy
ежедневной
is what
основе в
they
контексте
exhibit
множества
every
конфликтов,
day
попирая
in different
суверенитет
conflicts,
государств,
not respecting
нагло
state
вмешиваясь в
sovereignty
их внутренние
and
дела,
shamelessly imposing their own
навязывая
rules
собственные правила,
and
которые
interfering in
стоят
their
жизни
internal
десяткам
affairs.
тысяч
As a
мирных
result,
граждан.
tens of thousands of civilian lives
Мы
have been
внимательно
lost.
следим за ситуацией и
We are
продолжим
watching
называть
the
своими
situation
именами
closely and will
происходящее и
continue to
тех, кто
call out
несет за него
abuses and those
ответственность,
who
включая
are
прежде всего
responsible,
Соединенные Штаты.
particularly the United States.
Мы обязаны
We must
продолжить
continue
помогать
to
звучать голосам
amplify the
палестинского населения,
voices of Palestinian
призывающим к
people
установлению
who are
мира,
calling for peace,
благополучия и правосудия.
prosperity and justice.
И США не могут стоять на пути у
And
этого.
the United States cannot stand in the way of that.
Надеюсь, что вы поняли, что это
You
практически
gathered,
дословная цитата
I
из
take it,
вчерашнего
that
выступления
what I've
постоянного
just
представителя
quoted
Соединенных
is
Штатов
almost a direct quote
по
from
мотивам
yesterday's
голосования по
statement by the
резолюции,
United States
по
during the
резолюции по
voting
Судану.
on the resolution on Sudan.
По нашему мнению, цитата весьма
And in our
подходящая.
view, this was a very appropriate
Благодарим наших
quote.
американских
We'd like
коллег,
to thank
что
our American
они
colleagues
нас избавили
for the fact
от необходимости
that they
готовить
relieved
большую
us
часть нашего
of the
выступления по мотивам
need
голосования
to preparing most of the
вчерашним
statement
заявлением.
in the explanation of the vote because of their statement yesterday.
Обращусь к
Now I
американским
will
коллегам.
address my American
Сегодня
colleagues
вы
and
окончательно
say that
расписали
you
своей
today
полной
have
ответственности за гибель
definitively
десятков
shown
тысяч
that you are
невинных
fully
граждан,
responsible for the
лишения
death of tens
беженцев,
of thousands
страдания
of innocent
заложников
civilians,
и
for the
незаконно
privations of
удерживаемых
refugees,
палестинцев.
suffering of hostages, and the illegally detained Palestinians.
Любопытно было сегодня слушать
It was
выступление
very
американского
interesting to
представителя
hear
по
the
мотивам
representative
голосования.
of the American
Он,
representative
например,
today in
утверждал,
the
что
wake of the
резолюция
vote.
не
For
содержит
example, he
положение
said
об
that the
освобождении
resolution does
заложников.
not contain provisions on the
Может
release of
быть,
hostages.
она как раз содержит такое
Well,
положение.
it does
Может,
contain
американскому
such a
представителю
provision.
стоило бы
Perhaps
прочитать
the U.S. representative
эту
should
резолюцию,
read
прежде чем
through
голосовать
the
против нее.
resolution before voting against
Он
it.
также утверждал, что
He also
резолюция не
stated that the
содержит
resolution does not
осуждение атак
have
7
a
октября.
condemnation of the
Хотим
attack on the
напомнить
7th of October. I would like to
нашим американским
remind our
коллегам,
American colleagues here
что это именно Соединенные Штаты
it was the
18
United
октября
States
2023
who, on the
года
18th of October
заветировали резолюцию
2023,
Совета,
vetoed a
содержащую
Security
осуждение
Council
атаки
resolution
7
which
октября.
condemned a condemnation of the 7th of October
Соединенные
attack.
Штаты
The
преподносят себя как
United States
ключевого
positioned
партнера не
themselves
только
as a key
Израиля, но и
partner
государств
not just for
арабского мира.
Israel but also for
Однако
the
голосуют
Arab
против
states.
резолюций,
But they vote
идущих в
against
интересах всех
resolutions
арабов
who
и
are in the interest
поддерживаемых
of
самими
all the
арабами.
Arabs and supported by the Arabs
Приняв
themselves.
этот документ,
If
мы
the
могли бы
draft had been
потребовать от
passed,
Израиля
we could have
прекратить его
demanded that
смертоносные
Israel
атаки в
end
Газе,
its
на
deadly
западном
attacks
берегу,
in Gaza, in the West
обуздать его
Bank,
стремление
that
продолжать
it rein
агрессию
in
в
its
отношении
continued
Ливана
aggression
и
against
Сирии.
Lebanon and Syria.
Могли бы
We could
адресовать
have
четкий
sent a
сигнал
very clear
сторонам
signal to the
прекратить
parties to
насилие,
end
перейти к
violence and move on to the
политико-дипломатическому
political and
урегулированию
diplomatic
палестинского
settlement of
вопроса.
the Palestinian issue.
Хладнокровное и
But the cold
циничное
and cynical
препятствие со стороны
opposition by
Соединенных
the
Штатов
United States
простому требованию со
to the
стороны
simple
Совета
demand on
Безопасности
behalf of the
спасти
Council
человеческие
to
жизни
save human
является
lives
бессовестным
is an
и
unconscionable
бесчеловечным
and
поступком.
inhumane act.
У нас нет сомнений, что
We
и
have no
сами
doubt
израильтяне
that the Israelis
заинтересованы в
themselves are
прекращении
interested in
спирали
ending the spiral of violence,
Категорически не
and we
приемлем
categorically
попытки
reject
преподнести
attempts to
события 7
present the
октября
events on the 7th of
2023
October of
года как
2023
отправную
as
точку
the
для
starting
нынешних кровавых
point for the
событий в
bloody
регионе.
events in the region
Причины
now.
кроются
The
гораздо
reasons
глубже
for that are
и
much
связаны с
deeper,
многолетней
and they have to
исторической
do with a very
несправедливостью,
old historic
когда одним была
injustice
дана
where
возможность создать свое
one side
государство,
was given the
а
opportunity
другим
to create their
такому
own
же праве
state, and
последовательно
others have
отказывались.
been consistently denied the exact same right.
Мы продолжим
We will
твердо
continue
выступать за прекращение
speaking
насилия в отношении
resolutely
палестинцев.
for
Без тени
demanding the end
сомнения
of
будем и
violence
далее
against
высвечивать
Palestinians. No doubt,
злоупотребление
we
и
will
ханжество,
continue
с
calling
которыми
out the
Соединенные
abuses
Штаты
and
подходят к
hypocrisy
урегулированию
by the
ситуации.
United States when it comes to
Не
settling the
допустим,
situation.
чтобы
We
американцы
will
своими
not
руками
allow the
затыкали
United
рот
States to
всему Совету в
muzzle the
стремлении
voice of
поощрять
the Council when
дальнейшее продолжение
and
безжалостной
continue
операции со стороны
emboldening
Израиля.
further merciless operations by
Наш
Israel.
общий долг сделать
Our
так, чтобы
common
голоса
duty is to make
подавляющего
sure that the
большинства
voices of
жителей
the
нашей
absolute
планеты в
majority
пользу
of the people
прекращения
on this
спирали насилия,
planet to end
справедливого
the spiral
решения
of violence
палестинского вопроса
in
на
favor
известной
of just
международно-правовой основе
settlement of the
и
Palestinian
обретение
issue on the basis
Палестины
of an
полноправного
acknowledged
членства
basis
в Организации
and the desire
Объединенных
to become a
Наций
full
были
member
услышаны.
of the UN, that these voices be
Мы должны
heard.
принести мир,
We must
стабильность
bring
и
peace,
процветание на
stability, and
Ближнем Востоке.
prosperity to the Middle
И
East.
никто, в том
And no
числе
one,
Соединенные Штаты и
including the
другие
United
потакающие
States and
представители Запада,
other
не
Western
вправе
states who
препятствовать
indulge them,
этим
has a
законным
right to
чаяниям.
inhibit
Благодарю.
these aspirations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. Since the adoption of Resolution 2735 this past June, the Security Council has been hoping and expecting the finalization of the deal to achieve an immediate ceasefire and release of all hostages in Gaza. As the president of this council in June, I remember how desperately all council members aspired for the swift implementation of this resolution, which urges both parties, notably Hamas, to accept the proposed agreement. Since then, 5 months have passed, and the conflict has brought even more death, misery, and destruction to Palestinian civilians and Israeli hostages. And it is deeply disappointing that in spite of the efforts by mediators, US, Egypt, and Qatar, Resolution 2735 has yet to be implemented. The Republic of Korea still hopes that those diplomatic efforts will lead to a fruitful outcome that accomplishes an immediate ceasefire along with the release of all hostages. Madam President, as repeatedly pointed out, under this ceaseless armed conflict in Gaza, humanitarian efforts cannot deliver substantive results. An immediate ceasefire is not only an option, it is the only way to save lives in Gaza. This is why the 10 elected members of the Council, including the Republic of Korea, commenced a new initiative demanding an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and in parallel, demanding an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. It is regrettable that the draft resolution could not garner the support needed to be adopted today. However, we do believe that all members of the Security Council agree on the imperative of an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, though members may have different views on how to arrive at the goal. Thus, the Republic of Korea will not lose hope for a ceasefire and the release of all hostages at the earliest possible juncture. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, let me express appreciation to Guyana for its important role in pushing forward this important initiative for resolution. It has been more than 400 days since Hamas and others killed more than 1,200 Israelis and took more than 200 hostages, which Japan firmly condemns. Until now, the devastation in Gaza has shown no signs of abating, with tens of thousands of civilian casualties, an appalling death toll of UN personnel and humanitarian aid workers, and massive displacement. Given the ever-worsening situation, this draft resolution, if adopted, would have been a much-needed pronouncement by the Security Council demanding an immediate ceasefire, as well as an immediate release of all hostages. This passage could also have sent a strong message towards a dramatic expansion of humanitarian aid throughout the Strip, in particular to the most vulnerable Palestinians in the north. Therefore, Japan joined all the other elected members as co-pen holders of this draft resolution and voted in favor. It is deeply regrettable that we could not come to a text which all the Council members can accept. However, now is not that moment to trade accusations for the continuation of this nightmare. The Council member that could not support the draft resolution is working tirelessly to end the agony in Gaza, and Japan continues to support their diplomatic efforts. Madam President, despite today's setback, we should not stop working to improve the catastrophic situation on the ground. Today is World Children's Day, but without our collective actions, the children in Gaza, the future of Gaza, will continue to pay the high price of this conflict. This Council must keep their plight in mind as we work to immediately bring about the long-awaited ceasefire. Japan remains steadfastly committed to this end, both here at this Council and through multilateral and bilateral channels as well. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank all the elected members, in particular our coordinator from Guyana, for their tireless efforts for urgent and necessary action by this Council. And I thank all of the members that supported our resolution.
As the co-sponsor,
Switzerland voted in favour of this draft resolution and regrets that it was not adopted due to the veto of a permanent member. More than 5 months after the adoption of Resolution 2735, this draft reaffirmed our commitment to an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire, to the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and to the safe, rapid and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to the civilian population. Switzerland would like to underscore that the obligations of the parties in this matter continue, regardless of whether or not resolutions are adopted by this Council. It is high time that the parties respected these obligations and protected civilians and civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law. The violence and dehumanization in this conflict must end. I would like to underline the strong commitment of the group of elected members to unified action by the Council. The Council can continue to count on us for future action to promote peace and security between Israelis and Palestinians and in the region as a whole.
Madame President,
the situation is urgent. In Gaza, civilians are exposed to hostilities, incessant displacement, epidemics and the risk of imminent famine, while the hospital system has been almost completely destroyed. As the occupying power, Israel has a duty to ensure that the basic needs of the population in the occupied Palestinian territory are met. This Council must also act in accordance with its mandate to bring about a ceasefire, release all hostages, and protect civilians, including humanitarian personnel, particularly those of the UN. There must be an end to human suffering, a halt to the escalation of violence in the region, and the foundations laid for the solution of two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. Switzerland will continue to support all efforts in this direction. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. After 5 weeks of intense negotiations and a vote in favour by 14 members of this Council, Guyana deeply regrets that we were unable today to adopt the resolution tabled by the elected member states of this Council to pronounce on the apocalyptic situation in Gaza. The main objective of this draft resolution was to address some of the most critical issues that currently feature in Israel's more than year-long war on Gaza. Those critical issues include the ongoing atrocities of a scale and intensity that caused the death toll to climb on a daily basis and which has now surpassed 43,000. The continued captivity of persons taken from Israel in the brutal attack of 7th of October, and the humanitarian situation that appears to have reached its nadir, but then still worsens in unimaginable ways. The resolution just considered responded to these critical issues, building on the legally binding framework that the Council had established through the 4 previous resolutions adopted since 7th of October. Importantly, this resolution would have gone further by adding several critical dimensions to that framework. Those include, for the first time, an unequivocal call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, an affirmation of the centrality of UNRWA's role in the humanitarian response in Gaza, as well as an affirmation that respect for the International Court of Justice and its functions is essential to international law and justice, and to an international order based on the rule of law. Contemplating the end of the war and the mammoth investments that would be required for reconstruction, the resolution sought to make a contribution to day-after planning by requesting the Secretary General to prepare a comprehensive report which would include a needs assessment for Gaza in the short, medium, and long term. It is deeply disappointing, therefore, that these constructive contributions could not be added to the legally binding framework already in place on the war in Gaza. Madam President, many have said that the ongoing annihilation of the Palestinian people is a major stain on our collective human conscience. Today, the Council had the opportunity to begin erasing that stain by demanding an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. But despite our best efforts and the almost universal support to go in that direction, the Council was again hamstrung by a veto. Guyana hopes that the inability of the Council to adopt this resolution will not be seen by those who want to continue this war as a license to continue killing, starving, and maiming innocent civilians. Madam President, the continuation of sheer misery cannot and must not be the fate of Palestinians. Their suffering must end. They need to see the seeds of peace being planted by this Council. They need to see that this Security Council is giving peace a chance. That hope was dashed today, but it has not been eclipsed. Guyana will continue to work with fellow Council members to try to achieve tomorrow what we could not achieve today. Not trying is simply not an option. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. I'd like to start by thanking Guyana and the E10 for their tireless work on this resolution. The United Kingdom voted for this resolution as an expression of our determination to end this war, stop the suffering in Gaza, and secure the immediate release of the hostages. The UK remains resolute in our call for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate release of all hostages cruelly held by Hamas since the 7th of October 2023, and urgent action to address the humanitarian crisis. The deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic and unacceptable. All of Gaza is at the risk of famine, and in some areas, this is likely to be imminent. yet the aid reaching civilians remains entirely insufficient to mitigate this unfolding disaster. The unthinkable hardship that civilians are already facing in Gaza is set to get even worse as winter approaches. Israel must take urgent action to alleviate this crisis. International humanitarian law must be respected by all sides. We regret that the Council was unable to reach consensus on this issue. But, colleagues, we remain committed to the vision of this text, and we will keep striving alongside our partners to bring this war to a close, to secure the release of the hostages, and to secure a huge scale-up in aid and to protect civilians. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. My apologies for taking the floor. I just need to respond very briefly to some comments made by the representative of the Russian Federation. Let me just say, as I've said many times, Russia is in no position to single out any state for being responsible for the deaths and killings of civilians when every day it is raining down hundreds of missiles, bombs, and UAVs on the people of Ukraine, conducting some of the most savage and barbaric attacks seen in Europe since World War II. We will continue to remind the world of this barbarity, carried out by a permanent member of the Security Council in blatant violation of the UN Charter. So, Madam President, I would say to my Russian colleague that he should think twice before accusing anyone of hypocrisy. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Madam President, I'll be brief. I have a rhetorical question to the American representative. You don't have to answer. Do you have any other narrative apart from the one that he has delivered today? When we hear what he's saying, we get the impression that we're watching Groundhog Day, the movie. Groundhog Day. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Observer State of Palestine.
Thank you, Madam President. There is no right to mass killing of civilians. There is no right to starve an entire civilian population. There is no right to forcibly displace a people. And there is no right to annexation. This is what Israel is doing in Gaza. These are its war objectives. This is what the absence of a ceasefire is allowing it to continue doing. This full-fledged Israeli assault against the Palestinian people and the Palestinian land is about everything except the hostages. If the families of hostages can see that, how can anyone in this room claim otherwise? A ceasefire will allow to save lives, all lives. This was true a year ago. This is even more true today. A ceasefire doesn't resolve everything, but it is the first step towards resolving anything. And what is the answer of those who are still unwilling now, after all this death and destruction, not to call for an unconditional ceasefire? Is it to accept that the killing should continue until we resolve everything while we watch that we are resolving nothing? We heard over and over again statements in this chamber by all members without distinction about protection of civilians, about rejecting forcible displacement, about rejecting starving the Palestinian population, about rejecting annexation, about rejecting wanton destruction, about rejecting regional escalation. Everyone around this table agreed on these objectives. And yet here we are. 44,000 Palestinians killed. This is those who are accounted for. Many more are not accounted for. One day we will retrieve them in mass graves under the rubbles, and we will discover the real numbers of this horror. And there will be many that we will never retrieve. Famine that is looming all over Gaza, that is a reality in northern Gaza. 2 million people displaced, still hunted even when they are in tents. Total destruction of Gaza and all the requirements of life in it. And war on Lebanon, its people and its sovereignty. What does it mean to proclaim all these principles, we reject, we reject, we reject, and then shield Israel of the consequences of its actions, thus allowing it to do exactly what we're asking it to stop doing? Madam President, the world should not grow accustomed to the death of Palestinians, to seeing Palestinian children starving, to seeing mothers carrying their children from one place to another, forcibly displaced. They should not get accustomed to seeing journalists killed and humanitarians killed, to see Palestinians detained, abducted, carried on trucks to go be tortured, sexually abused, and raped. The fact we are Palestinians does not make that less shocking or less outrageous. Maybe for some we have the wrong nationality, the wrong faith, the wrong skin color. But we are humans, and we should be treated as such. Is there a UN charter for Israel that is different from the charter you all have? Tell us. Is there an international law for them, an international law for us? Do they have the right to kill, and the only right we have is to die? What the hell does Israel need to do more for this council to act under Chapter 7? What more can they do for this council to act under Chapter 7? Or will this council be the last place on earth that cannot recognize a threat to peace when they see it? When it is so glaring, so undeniable? You are witnessing the attempt to annihilate a nation, destroy a nation. It is not even hidden. It is in plain sight. And yet the very tools designed to respond to these situations are not being used. So which one is it? Are Palestinian lives not worth saving? Or does Israel have a license to kill? Can this council only adopt resolutions and then witness their blatant breach? This self-inflicted powerlessness has to stop. And like Algeria, we repeat, the resolutions of this council are binding. Their role is to be enforced. Their role is to change reality, not to record violations for history's purposes and then allow them to continue. Had diplomatic efforts succeeded, we would not be here. We recognize all the efforts that were done, all the diplomatic efforts that were conducted. And yet, we have to recognize children are still starving in Gaza. Families are being killed. Communities are being obliterated. Had these efforts succeeded, we would not be here. But what we cannot accept is that Israel has a veto that blocks any attempts to put an end to this war, especially when we know what are its true intentions. Madam President, many peoples, many governments around the world are saying the right things and trying to do the right things. And we have here to express our gratitude to the E10 for their relentless efforts for over a year now, and in the recent month. We all were hoping that 2735 would lead to a ceasefire. And we can discuss who is responsible for that ceasefire not occurring. For us, it is pretty clear that Israel had never an intention to accept a ceasefire and has found every reason not to have a ceasefire. We thank Guyana for its efforts in coordinating the E10 initiative. We thank all of those who have voted in favor of this resolution, and we agree with Malta and with Algeria. This is the bare minimum. This is the bare minimum that morality, humanity, legality would plead for. And this bare minimum, even this bare minimum, was vetoed. I truly do not understand. And you're saying we cannot be for an unconditional ceasefire. What that means in effect now is that we are for a war. You're saying we cannot be for an unconditional ceasefire that does not release the hostages. Is this war releasing the hostages? Is it even trying to release the hostages? So what does it mean? We accept this war that is killing hostages and that is killing, maiming, terrorizing, destroying an entire nation. When is it enough? When is it the point where we say, no, we mean ceasefire now? Now. We will not allow you to not listen to us, to ignore us, to insult us, to play games with us. This resolution is trying to restore life, to save lives. It's not a dangerous message. The draft resolution is not a dangerous message. This veto is a dangerous message to Israel that it can continue executing its plans, the very plans you oppose. And the messages we send do matter. And that is the wrong message at the worst possible time. Israel is responsible for the Palestinian civilians it kills. It cannot be absolved of that responsibility. It is killing them purposefully, deliberately, repeatedly, massively. It is starving them on purpose. Nobody can deny it. We sat in this room, we heard every UN agency, every testimony, every NGO, Palestinian, Israeli, international, saying the same things. This is by design. What does it mean that release of the hostages should be unconditional? This is what the Council has said repeatedly now for a year. Release of hostages should be unconditional. But stopping killing Palestinians is conditional? There are acceptable conditions to stop the mass killing of Palestinians? There's 100 Israeli hostages, and there's 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. They deserve better. They deserve respect for their lives, for their suffering. Israel will always claim conditions have not been met because its plans require it to continue this war, to annex the land and destroy the people. And therefore, we can no longer accept its conditions. 14 months, and we are still debating if a genocide must be stopped. There's no justification whatsoever for vetoing a resolution trying to stop atrocities. No justification for that. Madam President, one day someone will dig up these meetings, the records of them, will see us pleading for the lives of our people over and over and over and over again. And they will try to understand why our calls were not heeded. They will look at the people who sat around this table and spoke and addressed you from all over the world to call on the Council to take action. They will read what everybody here has said, and then they will wonder how a genocide displayed on TVs known to the whole world was able to continue for this long. They will wonder if the whole world is against the mass killing, against the displacement, against the starvation, against the annexation. How come they all occurred? It is because we are allowed to speak about the rules, but not to enforce them. Because we can regret and reject, but not act. There are many states now stepping up to change this reality. We call on all states and all peoples to stand for life, for freedom, and for peace. We are out of time. We repeat, we are against harming any civilians. And we have more than our share of grievances. We could have sat here and tried to justify harming civilians. We never did, not one day. And we're still sitting here after tens of thousands of our people have been killed. Many have been detained. All have been traumatized. All have been displaced. We have many reasons to say otherwise, and yet we remain steadfast. There is no reason to harm civilians, regardless of their nationality, their origin, regardless of the circumstances. But our civilians, What about our civilians? They are worthy of protection. Their lives should be saved. People cannot sit and demand Palestinian pacifism under all circumstances and enable Israeli militarism. That cannot be done. Either you believe violence is an impasse, you believe there are no military solutions, and then you act for peaceful ones and reject military ones, or you let it be military. We are for a peaceful path. Even after all that has happened, we are for a peaceful path. Help us chart it, not block it. Stop them. Help us. You would be helping Palestinians and Israelis in our region and the world. Madam President, there is a world out there where Palestinian children are able to grow. We are not born to be occupied and killed and displaced. That's not our destiny, that's not our fate. There is a world where we could live and grow and see our children grow with no occupation, no bombs, no tents, no settlements, no walls, no military checkpoints, no prisons, no constant humiliation, no oppression, no house demolished, no amputations, no pain and no agony. That world can exist today if we were to act. And the fact we are not means that many, many more Palestinians will suffer and others will suffer. We are trying to get there. We are trying to find a path that leads us there, to freedom, to life, and to peace. That should be our common objective. There is a world where there's no war in the Middle East, where Palestinians and Israeli civilians go about their lives, where maybe they can look confidently towards the future and even envisage more bridges between them, where our region unleashes its true and full potential for the benefit of all states and all peoples. It's this future that is being destroyed before our very eyes. And the entire Palestinian civilian population is the primary victim. Madam President, we call on the General Assembly to uphold the responsibilities that the Council has failed to uphold, owing to the US veto. We call on all states to use all available tools to stop the massacres. What this resolution was calling for is an unconditional end to massacres, and that is always worth supporting.
I thank the representative of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. Before I start, I've listened to your speech very carefully, and you mentioned a future with no pain, no suffering, but you haven't mentioned one word during your speech, and I've listened very carefully. What about Hamas? You have to include in your speech a future for Gaza is a future with no Hamas. You cannot describe a world or reality and you're not mentioning this is the reason why we are sitting in this room today, the brutality of Hamas and the pain that the people of Gaza are suffering because of Hamas. Madam President, today most of the members of this Council failed. They betrayed their own principles, their responsibilities to the innocent, and their duty to uphold justice. The resolution brought before this chamber was not a path to peace. It was a roadmap to more terror, more suffering, and more bloodshed. Many of you attempted to pass this injustice. We thank the United States for exercising its veto, for standing on the side of morality and justice, for refusing to abandon the hostages and their families. The text ignored the suffering of the 101 innocent hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. Had it passed today, this Council would have sent a message to the world that terrorists can act with impunity, that the United Nations will shield and surrender to murderers, rapists, and kidnappers, rather than holding them accountable. Last week, Sasha Trofanov should have celebrated his 29th birthday, surrounded by friends and family. Instead, he is being held by terrorist monsters who recently released a video showcasing his torture. Sasha is starved, his face bruised, his spirit crushed. Hamas doesn't just imprison. They torment, they dehumanize, they rejoice in their cruelty, and now they know that this council will do nothing to stop them. I would like to remind Ambassador Navzia that Sasha is a Russian citizen. He is included in the 29 nations which have citizens held hostage by Hamas, your citizens. Neama Levy, a bright young woman, just 19 years old, was taken and dragged into hell. Neama volunteered at a kindergarten for refugees, bringing light and love to children in need. You have seen the horrible images. Her ankles cut, her sweatpants soaked in blood. Neama's innocence, her humanity, her dreams, all stolen by Hamas. And today, someone in this council told her family that her life is not worth enough to demand her freedom. Those who supported this resolution have announced to the world Sasha's life, Naama's life, and the lives of 99 other innocent people are not valuable enough to be a condition for a ceasefire. Today, the UN celebrates International Children's Day. Rather than demanding that little children like Ariel and Kfir Bivas will be released immediately after 411 days in captivity, this council is attempting to pass a resolution which declares that their precious lives are not worth your time. This is not diplomacy. It is appeasement. It is abandonment of the very ideal that this council claims to defend. The world should be clear-eyed about what this text truly represents. It rewards Hamas for their barbarity. It validates their strategy of using human shields, targeting civilians, and tormenting hostages in their terror dungeons. It would have set a horrifying precedent that terrorism pays, that violence is met not with condemnation, but with concessions. Why you couldn't agree about condemnation of Hamas? You mentioned you worked tirelessly about drafting this resolution. Couldn't you sit down, the 14 countries who voted for that, and agree about a condemnation in this resolution? Like one line? We condemn the atrocities of Hamas? Was it so difficult? This council has already adopted 4 resolutions demanding the release of the hostages. Hamas has ignored every one of them. Why wouldn't they? They have faced no consequences for their crimes, no repercussions for their atrocities, no accountability for their barbarity. Madam President, the loss of civilian life in Gaza is a tragedy. But it is a tragedy authored by Hamas. They started this war. You have to say it. You have to say that they started on October 7th. We are not here because we wanted to be here. They have held innocent Israelis hostage for over 400 days with no sign of life or humanitarian access. They use Palestinian civilians as human shields. If this council fails to place the blame on the terrorists, it only emboldens them further. Israel will continue to defend itself. We will never abandon our hostages. And you have to understand that. Look at your values and understand why. We will never forget them, and we will never stop fighting for their freedom. If Hamas were to release the hostages and surrender their weapons, not one more shot would need to be fired. But until that day comes, Israel will do whatever it takes to protect its people and bring our loved ones home. Today, this council had the opportunity to stand on the side of justice, decency, and humanity. If not for the United States, it would have chosen appeasement, to reward terror and abandon the innocent. History will remember this vote. It will remember who stood with the hostages the victims, and the principles of peace, and who betrayed them to shield terrorists. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
It's balanced?
The third one should be here.
Okay. Good morning, members of the media. I'm honored to make this statement on behalf of the 10 elected members of the Security Council, namely Algeria, Ecuador, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, Switzerland, and my own country, Guyana. Today, a resolution drafted by the E10 member states was tabled for adoption by the Security Council to address the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. The resolution was developed over a 5-week period, during which the E10 demonstrated great flexibility to reach consensus in the Council. At the time that the decision was taken to develop this draft, 4 months had elapsed since the passage of Resolution 2735. We had all supported 2735 with the expectation that a ceasefire deal would have been agreed and implemented swiftly. Therefore, in the context of a rapidly increasing death toll and widespread injury, destruction, and forced displacement in the Gaza Strip, we, the E10, concluded that any new resolution by the Council should go further than the last 4 resolutions in relation to the conflict in Gaza. Importantly, our delegations acknowledged the significance of unequivocally demanding an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, while also reiterating the demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We are therefore deeply disappointed that the text was not adopted. Notwithstanding the non-adoption of the draft resolution that we put forward, the E10 is using this platform today to underscore 3 key messages. First, the war in Gaza must end immediately, unconditionally, and permanently, and all remaining hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. Second, there must be full, rapid, safe, and unhindered entry of humanitarian assistance at scale to and throughout the Gaza Strip, so that Palestinian civilians can secure the relief they urgently need. In this regard, we also stress that UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, and we call on all parties to enable the agency to carry out its vital mandate. Third, the parties must abide by their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, particularly with regard to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, the treatment of detainees, and the delivery of humanitarian aid. Our collective efforts to end the hostilities will not stop. Once more, the E10 is underscoring to the international community, and more importantly, to the hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians who continue to bear the cost of these hostilities, as well as those still held hostage and their loved ones, that we are deeply conscious that the Security Council bears the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace. We are deeply committed to this responsibility and will continue our best efforts to try to facilitate Council unity on this critical matter. Too many lives have already been lost. I thank you.
Ambassador, Xu Deju with China Central Television. Now it's the 5th time that U.S. vetoed the draft resolution calling for ceasefire. What now? What are we going to have in the Security Council? What is the way out? Thank you.
We will continue our efforts. Thank you.
Do you think Israel is committing genocide in Gaza?
You can decide.